Today we will be discussing the biological basis of behavior. This will be coming from your textbook in Chapter 3. Start off with discussing the brain. As you see, there's a little animation there. Some of you may have grown up watching Pinky and the Brain. If you did, you know that the brain basically told Pinky what he needed to do every day, which we all know was basically to take over the world. Well, the brain works in the same way for us. It is basically our command center within our body. It is responsible for controlling how our body reacts and responds to any stimuli that we come into contact with. Psychobiology. This is actually the field of study that focuses on biological foundations of behavior and mental processes. We know that the brain is a complex organ and that it does a lot of things to change and adapt as we grow. The two major systems of the brain that psychobiology focuses on is the nervous system and the endocrine system. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about the basic building blocks of these systems. You have your nerve cells and your neurons. These are what is considered the basic building blocks of the brain. Now, your neurons, these are basically individual cells that receive and transmit information. They are also known as the messengers, sending messages throughout the body to tell the body how to react and respond to stimuli. Now, these messengers, or your neurons, this is basically a neuron cell body here. As we stated before, the primary purpose of a neuron is to receive and transmit information. Now, your neuron cell body makeup is comprised of a nucleus. This is where your chromosomes and your genes are located. Cytoplasm, this is actually the part of the neuron that keeps the cell alive. And the cell membrane, this is basically an outer coating that protects the neuron cell body. You also have dendrites. Dendrites are short fibers that branch out from the cell body, and they pick up on all of the incoming messages, basically responsible for input. Then you have your axons. These are also single long fibers that extend from the cell body, and their primary purpose is to carry outgoing messages, or output. So your dendrites are for input and your axons are for output. Now, a single neuron can have hundreds of dendrites, and an axon can branch out in numerous directions. Now, your nerves, what are considered your nerves, are comprised of a group of axons that are bundled all together. Now, there are different types of neurons. You have your sensory neurons. These are basically the neurons that carry messages from your sense organs to your spinal cord. Then you have your motor neurons. These carry messages from the spinal cord to the brain, muscles, and the glands. Basically anything involved in motor movement. And then you have something that's either called your interneurons or your association neurons, and these are sort of the middleman. They carry messages between these two sensory and motor neurons here. Now, neurotransmitters. These are basically chemicals that are released in the body that affect your neighboring neurons. They're released by the synaptic vesicles. These are tiny sacs that release chemicals into your synapse. They travel across and affect all of these adjacent neurons here. Now, your common neurotransmitters that you need to be familiar with are these listed here, and they have been used to treat different conditions and diseases that people have had. You have your acetylcholine, and this has been used to help with people that have Alzheimer's disease, because this neurotransmitter is involved in arousal, attention, memory, motivation, and movement. All of those are things you know get affected with someone who has Alzheimer's. Then you have your dopamine. This has been used to treat diseases such as Parkinson's. This neurotransmitter is involved in emotions such as pleasure and also behaviors. You have your serotonin. Use that in a lot of medicines that treat depression. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that is involved in sleep regulation, dreaming, mood, pain, eating, and aggressive behaviors. Then you have your norepinephrine, another common neurotransmitter. It's involved with arousal, wakefulness, learning, memory, and mood. And then your endorphins, basically involved with pain inhibition. Now, endorphins are something that our body naturally releases when we hurt ourselves to help cope with the pain. These endorphins are 48 times more powerful than morphine. Different things can affect the body. The effects of drugs, such as cocaine or even caffeine, can inhibit or enhance the body's natural production of these neurotransmitters, and those can cause things to get out of balance. Now we're going to talk about something called neurogenesis. For decades, researchers and neurologists thought that the brain did not produce new brain cells. That basically you were born with all the brain cells that you would have for your lifetime. However, with new discoveries, researchers have found that the brain actually grows new neurons all the way until it dies. This regeneration is what is called neurogenesis. So, growth of new neurons. Now, why is this important? If you can grow new neurons, sending new messages, telling the body what to do, affecting neurotransmitters and how we are awake, how our memory works, our mood, our emotions. These sort of things have great implication for treating neurological issues, such as reversing brain damage in people that have strokes and have issues with motor movement or sensory neurons. This type of growth of neurons is something that is still on the rise. Still, researchers are working on and learning how this may help. Another thing that falls under this umbrella of neurogenesis is stem cell research. What they found so far is that fetal nerve cells have been transplanted into Parkinson patients, and they have seen improvement in motor function. Stem cell research, as you know, there are a lot of ethical issues and ethical concerns behind this type of research. So this is definitely something that is new in terms of the psychobiology field and field of neurogenesis that continues to grow as we learn more and more about the brain and neurons and how our bodies work. Now, we're going to talk about the central nervous system here. A little quote for you for your enjoyment. So, first off, we're going to start, what is the nervous system? Well, you have your central nervous system, which is the division of nervous systems that consist of the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the basic task of your nervous system is to receive sensory messages, to organize input and integrate with existing information, and to use that integrated information to send messages to your muscles and glands. So basically, it is a communication network. It coordinates and directs the body's actions. Now, the central nervous system contains about 90% of the body's neurons. So definitely a very, very important part of the nervous system in terms of how our body communicates and actions are taken out. Now this is a little structural chart here. Basically shows you the nervous system and how it's organized. You have your central nervous system there, basically consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And we'll talk about the peripheral nervous system later. Now there are 3 evolutionary layers of the brain. You have the central core, the limbic system, and the cerebral hemispheres. Starting with the central core. The central core is responsible for controlling the basic bodily functions, such as heart rate, breathing, things that keep you alive and moving. These are some of the things that make up that central core. You have your medulla, which is responsible for respiration, heart rate, blood pressure. Your pons, which controls sleep and wake cycles. Your cerebellum, balance and coordination. You have your midbrain, responsible for hearing, sight, and pain. Your hypothalamus, for emotions and motivation. Reticular formation, for attention and alertness. Your hippocampus, for new memories, the formation of new memories. And your amygdala, sort of your self-preservation. Any emotion related to self-preservation falls under the amygdala. And then your thalamus, responsible for the higher brain centers. It regulates these functions in the higher brain centers and in the peripheral nervous system. Basically a sensory relay. The PNS there stands for peripheral nervous system. Now, the cerebral cortex. This is the newest part of the brain. The outer layer of the brain that regulates our complex behaviors. These include things such as thought, vision, language, memory, and emotion. Now, there are two cerebral hemispheres that regulate these processes. It is the largest part of the brain. 80% of the weight of the human brain and 70% of the neurons that are in the nervous system are in this cerebral cortex. Now, this cortex, as we stated, is made up of those two hemispheres, but those two hemispheres also have 4 lobes. Now, these are the 4 lobes of your brain. You have your occipital lobe. This lobe receives and processes visual information. So anything that you see. Then you have your temporal lobe. This is responsible for auditory information. So things that you hear. Also responsible for smell, balance, emotion, language comprehension, and complex visual recognition, such as facial recognition. Then you have your parietal lobe. This lobe receives sensory information and is responsible for visual spatial information. So things such as sensations of heat, pressure, pain, and your spatial ability. Then you have your frontal lobe. Your frontal lobe pretty much controls voluntary movement, complex problem solving, concentration, coordinates messages from the other lobes of the brain, and aspects of your personality. It is the center of executive function. Now, we talked about those layers of the brain. You have here the limbic system. Now, the limbic system has evolved. It is the only part, it is only fully developed in mammals, as far as we know at this point. It's located between the central core and the cerebral hemispheres. It is a ring of structures that plays an important role in learning and emotional behavior. Your hippocampus and amygdala are part of the limbic system. So those parts of the central core that are responsible for formation of new memories and emotions that you experience that are associated with self-preservation. Now, going back to those two hemispheres of the brain, you have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And each of these hemispheres take care of different aspects of how we function. These two hemispheres are connected by your corpus callosum. This is basically how both sides of the brain work together. And we'll talk a little bit more about these different aspects of the left and right brain. But you have something that you need to be familiar with, these two terms, the contralateral motor control and lateralization. Contralateral motor control is communication of movement between the two hemispheres. And lateralization basically describes the functions that are carried out exclusively by one side of the brain. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. contralateral motor control. This motor area controls movement. It's located right there in the brain. The right hemisphere of your brain controls the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere controls the right side. Now, the same thing goes for all the type of sensory or visual, auditory information that we receive on a daily basis. The left is going to control the right, and the right control the left. So any sensory information coming into the left hemisphere is controlled by the right. Now, lateralized brain functions. These are basically, as we stated before, different hemispheres of the brain control different things. So we're going to go over some of the basic things here that these hemispheres are responsible for. Your left hemisphere for speech. As stated before, the movement of the right side of the body, sensation on the right side of the body, vision in the right half of the visual field. The right hemisphere, music and art appreciation. So your drawing ability, the reason you are all here in class today. That function comes from the right hemisphere. Movement of the left side of the body is controlled by the right hemisphere, and sensation felt on the left side of the body from the right hemisphere. Also, any visual information that comes in the left half of the brain, this right hemisphere. Now, there are certain things that are different. We'll go over in detail some of the right and left brain sort of aspects or functions. Now, if you have a left brain dominant sort of personality, which basically means that you prefer to use your left brain more than your right, you'll see that you like to see details before the whole picture. You're prone to reason and hard facts, sequential and orderly information processing. You're very verbal and reality-based. You like facts and real-life consequences. Now, if you prefer right brain thinking, you tend to look at the whole picture first and the details later. You're also prone to gut feelings and speculation versus those hard facts and reason that the left brainers like. Also, random information processing tends to be your preference if you're a right brainer. More nonverbal ways of communication, so that whole drawing ability, those sorts of things, that artistic creativity. And then tend to be more fantasy oriented, so more creative. Now, there's something that is called a hemispheric dominance test. It's just a little assessment. It's not a catch-all be-all, but it will give you an idea about your preferences, whether you're a right or left brain thinker. So, if you go on to Go Studio, you'll see under this week there is a Word document for you to pull up that is basically labeled, "Are you a right or left brain thinker?" The directions are there. You basically take this 32 question assessment, score it, and see whether you score higher as a left brain thinker or a right brain thinker. So if you would, please take a moment to do that. You want to make sure that you hold on to that assessment and bring it with you to class so we can discuss it a little further in the classroom. But take a few minutes, pause this presentation, and go on and take that assessment and see where you stand. Okay, so now that you've taken the assessment to determine whether you are a right or a left brain, which characteristics you prefer more, we're going to talk a little bit more about those differences, and you can see if this holds true for you or not. Now, if you're more prone or your preference is right brain thinking, then you tend to be more intuitive. You prefer questions that are open-ended, that allow you to elaborate. You prefer drawing and manipulating objects, and you're kind of free with your feelings. Also, pretty simultaneous type of thinker. something called a lumper. You like connectiveness. That is important to you. Also, you see correspondences and resemblances in things. You draw on unbound qualitative patterns that are not organized in sequences or orderly fashion, but tend to cluster around images. Now, if you're more of a left brain thinker, some of the characteristics here listed for you left brainers are that you're very rational. You tend to like to respond to verbal instructions. You prefer talking and writing. Instead of more open-ended questions, you prefer multiple choice tests. So you're okay with filling in the bubbles on the Scantron versus doing a short essay question. Also, you're in control of your feelings, so not as free with your feelings as if you were a right brain thinker. Very sequential. Distinction is very important to you. Very logical thinker, so you see the cause and effect of things. And you draw on previously accumulated knowledge or organized information to make conclusions on things. So just a quick overview of right and left brain. Left brainers tend to be logical thinkers, sequential thinkers, very rational, analytical, objective, and look at parts. Whereas right brain thinkers are random, more intuitive, holistic, synthesizing, subjective, and tend to look at wholes. So just some distinctions there. It is important to point out that these are preferences. No one side of the brain or one hemisphere is right or wrong. And no one is totally just a left brain thinker or just a right brain thinker. We use both sides of our brain to integrate information. But most people do have a dominant side or a hemisphere of the brain they prefer. It's similar to being right-handed. You may be right hand dominant, but that doesn't mean you can't use your left hand or that your right and left hand can't work together, but that you just prefer, if given the choice, to use your right hand. So same sort of concept when you're thinking about what type of thinker that you are. Now, we're going to jump over and discuss some gender differences that have been found in the brain. That age-old question as to why men and women think so differently. Well, some of these differences are here. Researchers have found that study the brain that there's differences in the position, connection, and size differences of the brains between men and women. They've also looked at, through brain imaging, what parts of the brain are in action when certain tasks are being done. And they found that on some tasks, women use both hemispheres, whereas men may only use one hemisphere, but they both are able to complete the same task. They just are using different parts of the brain to do so. There are some differences that have also evolved over time. Before industrialized society and technology and equality and all of these things that we had back during the hunting and gathering days, men tended to be better spatial navigators because they were the hunters in many societies, and that was a skill that was needed in order for them to survive. And women back then tended to be better at memory. Objects and fine motor skills were better than the men because of the functions that they were carrying out in their society: gathering food, cooking, mending clothes, those sort of things that require a lot of fine manipulation, a lot of memory, a lot of organization. Those sorts of things are some skills that are used now to sort of explain why men and women brain or think differently. Now we're going to talk now about your corpus callosum. This is basically the part of the brain that connects and communicates between the two hemispheres, between that left and right hemisphere. if the corpus callosum is ever severed, because it is responsible for transmitting those information from the left to the right hemisphere, you're going to lose some things. It can exchange the data. The sensory inputs get crossed and the motor outputs get crossed. So the corpus callosum is a very important part of the brain. How do we know all this? There have been tons and tons of different research and studies that have been done on the brain and what parts of the hemispheres are at work when we carry out certain tasks, and looking at the different lobes of the brain. But one of the most famous is the split brain studies. A lot of implications came out of these studies that have allowed us to treat people who have epilepsy or certain brain dysfunctions by understanding how the brain is working and what parts of the brain carry out what functions. We've been able to help a lot of people. Roger Sperry started these split brain studies back in the 1960s. He basically started out by looking at what comes into the brain, the input, and what comes out, the reaction, to learn what sides of the hemisphere were responsible for different tasks. Now, there can be times where if you didn't have that connection with that corpus callosum, that you may be looking at an object and the visual information goes into one side of the brain, but you're unable to name it because the part of the brain that needs to speak, that is responsible for speech, is unable to do so because there is not communication between the two hemispheres for one hemisphere to tell the other what I saw, and then that hemisphere to be able to verbalize that. So this is just a little diagram here that shows if the picture went into the right brain, can't name it, but the left hand can identify it by touch. If the picture went into the left brain, you can name it, and the left hand cannot identify it by touch. Now I want you to take a minute to watch this YouTube clip. This is about this very type of split brain study. There's a gentleman by the name of Joe who actually had to have his hemispheres severed. And this clip sort of shows you how he functions now that his two hemispheres are not in communication with one another. So click on the link and view that. Now the last thing we want to discuss for today is the spinal cord. We talked about the central nervous system being comprised of the spinal cord. Very important part. This spinal cord here, as you can see in the diagram, goes from the brain down throughout the body. It connects the brain to the rest of the body. And that spinal cord there houses something called your vertebral column. That protects all of those little nerves and neurons and all the messages that are shooting from your brain throughout your body. It protects that vertebral column there. It is made up of 31 segments. And that's why you see a lot of people who have spinal cord injuries, they have a loss of communication from the brain to the body. So their brain is unable to tell their body to move when the spinal cord is injured. Now these are your functions of the spinal cord. We already said to carry those messages between the nerves and the brains. But there are two major neural pathways you should be aware of. The ascending pathway and the descending pathway. The ascending neural pathway takes information, these messages, from the extremities and organs up to the brain. And the descending, those messages are being carried from the brain down to your organs and down to the muscles. Now, the spinal cord contains neural circuits that produce reflex movements that do not require movement from the brain. But you need these inner neurons to carry these messages to and from. Remember we talked about the types of neurons back when we first started the lecture. These inner neurons carry those messages between the sensory and motor neurons to tell the body what action, what response it needs to have to the stimuli coming into the brain.